I would encourage you to check out the Natural Running Center. It's down in North Carolina, South Carolina, run by a couple of docs down there. They have a great website, lots of videos, lots of informational stuff about how to do it, why it's beneficial, etc. Yes, ma'am.
I enjoyed the video with movenat.com,
Yeah.
but I'm just curious, how would you apply this to kids in an urban setting?
Sure, sure. There are challenges with being in nature, absolutely. Whether it's, you know, even in the little town that I live in, there's lots of, you know, we're surrounded by parks, but there's still this, you know, living in town, this issue, right? And I think we can still practice these skills, these movement skills, right? You don't have to be in nature to crawl, to bear crawl, or to walk on a balance beam, or to jump, or to swim. So the movement skills can be practiced anywhere. Ideally, of course, right, the idea is to try to do those in nature, but you can't do that in nature. I guess I would say is this, just because you can't do it in nature isn't a good reason not to do it at all. Right? I guess I would turn it around like that. So without a doubt, those movements can be practiced, can be developed anywhere, inside a gym, inside your house, right? So you don't have to be in nature.
So I really appreciate the, you know, the spirit and the logic behind all of this. And
Yeah.
I kind of like the idea that, you know, natural responses to unnatural stimuli. You know, how are we operating with food that our body wasn't prepared for?
Sure.
But I want to push back just a little bit, because I worry a little bit about the idea that, you know, man as is right now in this room was created, so to speak, in Paleolithic times stably, you know. And I feel like there's enough evidence from gene culture coevolution that there have been some real genetic changes in our digestive systems, you know, the lactose example. Amylose digestion has become much more facilitated, you know, things like that. And I guess I wonder, is it necessary to go all the way back? Or if we're going all the way back, are we in fact going to something we're no longer adapted for? And if there's some sort of in-between there?
Yeah, I think you were absolutely right. Absolutely right. I think I simplified it for the presentation, but I think that there are a couple problems with what I just did. Right? Just because our ancestral past was free of, just because people didn't eat grains and dairy in the past and they're free of diseases of civilization, doesn't mean that there is a causation there. It's simply a correlation. Right? So I think there's some. It's not enough to just to say our Paleolithic ancestors didn't eat this, thus we shouldn't. Right? All that does is allows us to create a theory, which then needs to be tested through the science. Okay? Just because we didn't eat corn doesn't necessarily mean corn's bad for us. Right? Because species all the time exploit novel food sources and thrive. So it's not just enough that these foods are new, but they are not healthy for us, right? This is the argument. And we need the scientific evidence, we need the research to show physiologically, biologically, how these are not healthy for us. And you're right, it's not the same for everyone. So some people are clearly gluten intolerant, celiac disease. And there appears to be a spectrum. Right? It's just not you have celiacs or you're fine, which is what we thought for a while. You have celiacs, or you have this sort of spectrum of intolerance. You have muscle cramps. You have irritable bowel syndrome, right, that comes from exposure to gluten or other problematic proteins. So I think you're absolutely right. It's more complicated. So what I would say is that many people are not tolerant of these Neolithic foods. So to paint it as black and white is wrong, is problematic. So I completely agree with you.
Is there any place where it's written about that makes sense. I mean, you know, give up all cheese and dairy and things. I mean, everything in moderation, but is there some place where the paleo people write about it?
Well, this falls into this body of like the fallacies of the paleo argument, right? And that's out there. I guess I would have a look at Matthew Lalonde's work. I don't know if he's published anything on this, but he's written on this and he's talked about it. Matthew Lalonde, he's from Canada, did a degree in PhD in chemistry at Harvard, is now a researcher at Harvard. So it's he talks about the fallacies of the paleo argument. Jesse.
Going a little more off what Dan B. O'Brien once said, I would argue that all children, when they're born, do not necessarily have the gut flora that's required to process dairy and gluten. And through being fed baby foods that contain gluten and lactose, they acquire the ability to process it. So it's really a gut flora adaptation to something that is not really native to our natural diet. But at the same time, you have to consider whether or not, which is why there's the primal diet and the paleo diet. The primal diet allows for some consumption of lactose, namely like cream, naturally fermented cheeses and things like that. So like kefir, you can eat that. But coming from a weightlifting background, I personally consume dairy because it's good for building muscle. I consume whey protein because it's good for building muscle. I could eat full paleo, but because full paleo is usually lower in carbohydrates, while I could have fruit, a natural source of carbohydrates, I tend to opt for bread because it's easily obtained and I can consume it in 5 minutes before I lift, and I won't have a complete blood sugar spike during my workout. But when you really go into these diets, you have to analyze them for yourself and see what fits your specific nutritional needs. Milk by nature is something that has a high fat content, is very, very nutritional for baby mammals. And if you're not a baby mammal, you're likely not growing at the rate that you need milk. So it's just things to consider when you're picking a diet for you.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, right? This is all very individual. Some people are going to do fine with dairy. Some people are going to be much more reactive. And again, this is not one size fits all, but it provides a lens to start making some choices. To say, hey, if I'm not happy with how I look and how I feel and how I perform, then this provides a template, a framework to make some choices, to experiment with some changes in how I'm living, to find what works best. Again, this is the theory of mismatch, the theory of discordance, right? This is not providing the answer for everyone with this theory. Yeah.
I just want to mention Steve Platek and his colleagues have either in press or recently published an article, I think in EvoS, on the functional benefits of strength training that you talk about. And he has some pilot study that supports some of the benefits of it that you alluded to.
Yeah, I was a co-author on that paper.
That was a reviewer, so.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your help with it. Appreciate it. How we doing on time?
We have 8 more minutes, but I'd
8
also
more-
like
okay,
to add
sure.
On the paleo diet, they have a lot of conventions where they discuss
I'm sorry, a lot of
conventions, conferences, paleo get-togethers where they grill lots and lots of steak. I really want to go to one just so I can eat like a giant T-bone, because that is right up my alley. But one of the things that I found a lot of female bloggers and paleo dieters gripe about is that there's this unrealistic image of paleo women where, because women, we have to have a certain body fat percentage to, I don't know, conceive children. The stereotypical paleo woman is this really cut, just very low body fat CrossFitter. person. And the CrossFit community was really one of the first communities that latched onto the paleo diet and brought it into the mainstream, I would say. But because there's this very low body fat image, it's really not any better than seeing like Scarlett Johansson or Kristen Bell or Stewart or whatever the Twilight chick name is who's practically anorexic. It's really no better than seeing models like that giving you what your standard of beauty should be as a woman. When in reality, women are designed to have body fat because we have to have periods in order to have children, and evolutionarily, we are the sex that conceives. And I've seen a lot of commentary and criticism about that, just so much anger on the internet from these women. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I don't. I'm not going to prescribe, what's correct body fat for women who
Over 14%.
who follow paleo, who follow any other kind of diet. I think you make a good point though about the reproductive necessity of adipose tissue, right? I mean, women do need this amount in order to be reproductively healthy, and that to me seems to me to be a sign of health more broadly, right? So I guess on that score, I would agree with you. Yeah. Yes, Dan.
And I don't know if I'm responding to you or to her.
Okay.
But thinking about this idea, people who go in for a diet like this oftentimes are doing so to reorganize their body in a sense,
Sure.
And I think it would be really interesting to see, if you would actually compare it to hunter-gatherer societies, whether the amount of physical activity that they get on a daily basis is actually equal to what someone who goes in for the paleo diet is doing, or if the caloric intakes and things like that. Because, again, you don't want to equate ethnicities, especially ethnicities that are as far removed as, those living in Western societies and those who have been living in hunter-gatherer for quite a long time, if not for their entire history. You don't want to equate those things, but my guess is the females in those populations do not resemble what Jesse was just describing
Right.
as the body type of your average paleo female.
Right. I think that's a great point.
You can look at documentaries and even see that. So like if you watch the Discovery Channel and watch them follow like Amazonian tribes, the women look, geez, like your average woman you'd find on the street, like your average healthy woman, not the 2/3 of the population obese women. But it's, in nature, you don't find women who are really, really thin, because women who are really, really thin can't conceive and they're not very strong and they get eaten by lions. So it's natural selection that you don't want a woman who's running around frail, breaking bones left and right because she's not getting enough calcium.
Sure. Nick, did you have another question? I thought I saw it.
Last year here, we heard Wrangham talk about the necessity for cooking.
Yeah.
And I wonder, in that way dovetail with what, your science here is with paleo?
Yeah, I think so. So, we can make this more complicated in terms of, do we cook our food? How much do we cook it? Do we eat raw food? Do we cook food? Do we eat meat? Right? It's something I didn't really, the question is, can you be a vegetarian and be paleo? I would say yes.
I think you argued against that. He didn't use the word paleo
Right.
diet, but.
Right, but I think, you don't have to eat meat to take this paleolithic approach.
That makes sense.
Cooking seems to be pretty important in terms of nutrient absorption, and that seems to be a crucial piece here. You just get more out of a cooked carrot than a raw carrot, and it takes less metabolic energy to digest that cooked carrot, which when you add up 2,000 calories a day in terms of digestion, that's a lot of metabolic activity.
Yeah, there's this raw fat kind of, you
Yeah.
mentioned that, kind of reminded me, does that dovetail at all with the paleo diet, or is that just kind of its own weird kind of niche?
Well, I'd say it's separate, but we can ask that question, right? through this evolutionary lens, does it make sense if we eat raw food or cooked food? Well, you know, based on Wrangham's work, it looks like cooking's been around a heck of a long time. Right? It looks like that may have been responsible for some important evolutionary development. So it seems like that's an important feature here of our ancestral past. In general, the paleo approach is to cook food. And in fact, through cooking, oftentimes anti-nutrients are destroyed. Right? So for example, legumes. Cooking beans destroys some of the anti-nutrients and makes the proteins easier to digest. So fermenting, soaking, cooking, these are all a form of processing. Right? The more you process a food in general, the easier it is to digest.
And we have time for like one or two more questions.
One or two more questions, okay. Pre-chewing food, right? I know there's a small movement out there now where mothers are pre-chewing their food and then giving it to their children. Pre-chewing whole foods and giving it to their infants. Yes?
I actually have an observation regarding the wearing no shoes when
Yes.
you're running. So I connected with an orthopedic researcher in Canada a few years ago. He had done some research showing that the more safety features you have on a running shoe, for example, more padding, the greater the number of injuries, controlling for amount of use. And what he found was that people who use less safe shoes actually run differently.
Yes.
The amount of torque that they use in terms of PSI is lesser. So that's kind of a homeostatic system whereby you're adjusting your risk as a function of what you're interacting with. And so that might fit with the story of why you may not get injuries when you're running barefoot, because biomechanically you might end up actually running differently without shoes.
I think that's absolutely true. And with running shoes with a high heel, in particular, what happens is that you heel strike. Right? You're striking first with the heel of your foot. You're landing on the heel, right? And that's basically bone to bone to bone up through your leg. When you run without shoes, right? You're landing on it's a mid-foot strike or a forefoot strike. You're landing on typically the ball of the foot. And what's absorbing then the loading is the plantar fascia in the foot, the ankle, the hamstring up the leg. So you're right. It's an absolutely different form of running, right? And if you watch little kids run, right, they run on their balls of their feet, right? They run in that quote unquote more natural style, and it's through these running shoes that we adopt this heel strike. Maybe we'll call it there.
All right, sounds
All
good.
right.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.